Okay, good morning. That was, I never need an excuse to play Radiohead, but that was their tribute to the last veteran of the First World War who died about this time last year, I think, called Harry Patch. An administrative note first. I wanted to remind those of you who are interested in doing a research paper in place of a final exam that you have to declare an interest in doing so, and ideally come and talk to me beforehand, or at the very least talk to Carrie or Katie, or send me an email to do that. I will need to have some declaration of interest. Many of you are already underway, and those of you who want to do it should really get going. So make sure you do that if you're interested, but you haven't yet got around to it. Okay, so let's move on, because I'm afraid today there's a lot of ground to cover. The Great War. The Great War was a great war, not in the sense that it was full of honor and destiny and all good things. It was a great war because it was unprecedented in its scale, in the degree of industrial violence, and in the very dramatic economic, social, political, and cultural consequences it had. It was the defining experience for several generations of Europeans and several generations of colonial soldiers too. One of these was my grandfather, christened as William Ralph Ellis, but nicknamed Jim, after the Irish trade unionist and socialist leader in Ireland. They had very different types of politics, so his friends thought it was funny to nickname him after someone who had radically opposed political views. And I'm going to give you a sense of my grandfather's experience of the war when we get to it. Let me say a couple of things. It wasn't just contemporaries who felt the Great War to be a seismic event, a life-changing event. Historians also have long considered it to be, to provide a radical change of gear, a defining moment. And probably the first example of that was this satirical publication which parodies the old Whig history of Britain, of sort of drums and trumpets, and here comes another monarch, and there's another battle, and Britain just keeps getting better and better. Written by these two people, W.C. Seller and R.J. Yeatman, both of whom were veterans of the First World War. And the book, this story of the triumphant history of Britain as a nation, comes to an end in 1919. It comes to an end not with the armistice, but with the Treaty of Versailles. Chapter 62 is simply called A Bad Thing, and it consists of the following sentence. America was thus clearly top nation, and history came to a period. So there's a real sense for historians, ever since they've begun to write about the First World War, that the world for Britons was never going to be the same again. And basically, there are a number of debates that historians have in trying to make sense of this cataclysmic event. One school of thought suggests that the demands of fighting this new type of total and industrial war meant a decisive end to the liberal version of Britain that I've spent the semester so far talking about. That it demanded an unprecedented degree of state intervention into social, political and economic life, and it effectively meant the end of the old liberal system of laissez-faire. Moreover, in order to win the allegiance of the soldiers who were fighting for it, it became a harbinger of a new type of social contract between the population of Britain and its government. Now, some people argue that the First World War brought that shift. Other people say, look, that trend has been going on for a while. And they would point, for instance, to the types of changes that I've been highlighting to you going on from the 1870s and 1880s, with people becoming increasingly aware of the frailties and vulnerabilities of the old liberal political economy. There is then a third position, which is to say that the Great War really changed very little at all, that it was a type of bubble, and that beyond it, Britain quickly returned to an attempt to rehabilitate the vision of liberal England that had existed beforehand. And many people argue that this lasts down to the experience of the Second World War. So, such is the dramatic nature of this war that, really ever since it's happened, historians have been eagerly debating what were its consequences and what did it change and how. I want to begin then this lecture by trying to show the way in which, at the beginning of the war particularly, people believed or hoped that the war was a continuation of the Victorian dream of liberal progress. And in a way, the outbreak of the war was sold to the British people in precisely this type of way. Okay, that the British people had a duty to respond to the great march of German militarism and tyranny. That Prussia had given rise to Germany. This was a tyrannical and militaristic state, and it was opposed fundamentally to the freeborn liberties that Britain had long cherished and held. So that Britain's job was to defend liberty and defend freedom. The invasion of Belgium by Germany provided a fantastic propaganda opportunity for the British government and the British press. And there were consistent reports of German atrocities, of the rape of women, of the shooting of men in cold blood. And this was used to try and appeal to the British population's sense of honour and decency, and a call to their duty, and particularly to their masculine conscience, that you can't possibly let the Germans treat these poor defenceless Belgian women in this way. And of course the key thing was that Belgium was neutral, and Germany had not respected that neutrality. They had offended the rules of statecraft, of international law and statecraft. And of course, the inference of all of this is that if you don't stand up and do your duty, it will be your women and children who will be next. The vicious Hun will soon be at your own front doorstep, and it will be your women marched off into forms of gross indecency. Very quickly then, the war becomes associated with a new type of masculine patriotism. And in a way, this, I say new, but in many ways, it's very much a product of the very increasing sort of imperial and militarist culture that had proliferated in the Edwardian period around things like the South African War, the Boy Scouts, and all of this stuff that I talked to you about last week. Very critically, we have to remember that Britain's army for the first 2 years of the war was a volunteer army, that men volunteered en masse to go and fight in France against Germany. 2.5 million men volunteered to fight this war between August 1914 and January 1916, when conscription is finally introduced. And clearly men are doing that because they believe in the importance of the war. But it's also the case that men are doing it because if they stay at home, their masculinity is being called into question. And I want to illustrate this through this rather bizarre organization called the Order of the White Feather, okay, which was established by the leading woman anti-suffragist, a woman who had argued before the war that the women should not have the vote, named Mary Ward. And she established this order at the outbreak of the war in August 1914, and quickly gained the support, and this is important, quickly gained the support of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. So here you have the arch woman anti-suffragist and the two sort of leaders of the militant suffrage movement joining force, both calling for the introduction of universal male conscription, that the state should compel all men to go and fight. They hold recruiting rallies, and Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst even rename their paper Britannia, such as their rush to embrace the patriotic cause. Now, what the Order of the White Feather does is go round and hand out white feathers to those men of fighting age that are left in the country. The white feather to demark cowardice. And here you see a poster saying, "Is your best boy wearing khaki? If not, don't you think he should be? If he does not think that you and your country are worth fighting for, do you think he's worthy of you?" Okay, so the point is that women have an active role in fostering the patriotic citizenship of men to go and fight. Okay, so all of this still seems within the realm of the old masculine imperial rhetoric of the late Victorian and early Edwardian period. And the other great example of this is, of course, the sort of a heroic cult that builds up around T.E. Lawrence and his role in the in Mesopotamia, in basically the Middle Eastern theatre of war in what is now Iraq. Now, on this front, okay, there is still the association of war with a type of boy's own adventure. You know, you can ride around on camels, you can wear fancy headgear, okay, you can embrace different cultures, you can sit around drinking coffee. It was, you know, it seemed exactly like the boy's own adventure comics that had inspired so many young boys to become imperial adventurers. So the old romance of war, if you like, is still very much alive in this theatre. The experience in Europe is, of course, fundamentally different. And very quickly, this idea that the war could continue to build upon, indeed consolidate, the forward march of liberal progress is called into question.